The night was quiet, save for the intermittent beeping of the medical equipment and the soft shuffling of the nurse's shoes on the glossy floor. My colleague and I were in the middle of our rounds when we noticed that the call lights were going off in empty rooms. We exchanged a puzzled look and made our way down the hallway, checking each room one by one. But every time we entered a room, the call lights stopped flashing and there was no one there. We began to feel uneasy, and I suggested that we check the security cameras to see if someone was playing a trick on us. As we entered the security room, I couldn't help but notice how different it felt from the rest of the hospital. The walls were whitewashed wood, and there were various paintings hanging on the walls, adding a touch of warmth and personality to the room. I sat down in front of the monitor and started scanning through the footage. It was then that I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There on the screen was a figure dressed in all white, walking down the hallway with an old school nurse hat on their head. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I quickly called over my colleague to look at the monitor. "What in the world?" she exclaimed, staring at the monitor in disbelief. "Who could that be?" We sat there watching the figure on the screen as they walked down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. It was clear that there was no one there in real life, and yet there was someone on the screen. "I don't like this," my colleague said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This doesn't feel right." I nodded in agreement. Something was definitely amiss, and we both knew it. My colleague and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over us as we watched the footage of the mysterious figure on the monitor. We both knew that something wasn't right, but we couldn't quite put our finger on what it was. As we continued to watch the footage, we noticed that the figure seemed to be heading towards the room at the end of the hallway, where a patient who had recently passed away was staying. My colleague and I exchanged a worried look, and without a word, we made our way to the room. When we got there, we found the door slightly ajar. We pushed it open and peered inside. The room was empty, except for the bed where the patient had been lying. But something was off. The sheets were rumpled and twisted, as if someone had been lying there only moments before. "That's strange," my colleague said, her brow furrowed in confusion. Just then, we heard a noise coming from the hallway. We cautiously stepped out of the room and saw the figure in white, standing at the end of the hallway. She turned towards us, and I could see that she was wearing an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, complete with a hat and cape. My colleague and I stood frozen in fear, unsure of what to do. She started walking towards us, and we could hear her footsteps echoing through the hallway. As she got closer, we could see that her face was obscured by a surgical mask, but her eyes were piercing and seemed to be looking straight through us. Without warning, she suddenly disappeared, leaving us standing alone in the hallway, our hearts pounding in our chests. "What the hell was that?" my colleague asked, her voice trembling. "I have no idea," I replied, my mind racing with questions and fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The image of the old school nurse walking down the hallway in her pristine white uniform and hat wouldn't leave my mind. I had to know what was going on. I spent hours reviewing the security footage, combing through each and every frame for any sign of the mysterious figure. I watched as staff members went about their routines, patients sleeping soundly in their beds, but there was no sign of the nurse. My frustration grew as the night wore on, until finally I decided to take matters into my own hands. I got up from my desk and headed out into the hallway, determined to find out what was going on. The hallway was eerily quiet. The only sound was a soft hum of the air conditioning. I walked slowly, peering into each room as I went. All was still, and I was beginning to think I was just imagining things, when I heard a faint rustling sound coming from one of the rooms. I approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, half expecting to see the old school nurse staring back at me. But the room was empty. The only movement coming was from the fluttering of the curtains that were being blown by the breeze. Frustrated and unnerved, I continued my search. I spent the next hour checking every inch of the ward, but there was no sign of the nurse. Eventually, I gave up and headed back to the nurse's station, defeated. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I turned around, half expecting to see the nurse behind me, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway stretching out before me. We later found out no one has worn those uniforms in 30 years.